Good morning, and welcome to the All Souls live stream worship gathering for Sunday, April 19th. As we serve the greater good by remaining physically apart during this time of contagion, we nevertheless come together in mind and spirit through the gifts of technology. The poet Barbara Kingsolver writes, "O misery, imperfect universe of days stretched out ahead, the string of pearls and drops of venom on the web, losses of heart, of life and limb, news of the worst. Remind me again that the day will come when I look back amazed at the waste of sorry salt, when I had no more to cry about than this. For now I lay me down. I'm not there yet." We are not there yet. That's the problem. We have not yet come to the end of the beginning, but we want this crisis, with its extraordinary demands on our patience, our compassion, our self-restraint, our capacity for sacrifice. We want it to be over. We have done a hard thing. Is it not done? Like irritable children in the back of the car, we demand, are we there yet? And the truthful answer, as we guess, is no, not nearly. Dearly beloved, there is more to come. More hardship, more changes, more difficult truth, more lies. More conflicting advice, more confusion. We are yet a week away, some say, from the first wave of the virus peak here in Kansas City. Have we indeed flattened the curve enough? Will there be enough ventilators, enough beds, enough masks, enough competent hands? Perhaps. Or maybe not. How many ways are there to say, I don't know? What does seem to be true is that some of us will make it through to the other side. To this too shall pass. Not without change, and not without the ground that was always solid before, shifting beneath our feet. Not without the loss of who we love and who we were, and many precious things and people. Not without grief and shame and despair at whatever expedient gets you there and not others. Common sense or privilege or hereditary biology or sheer good luck. Who can say what tips the scale of survival? We will do what we can for each other, and that alone might be the difference. Encouragement at the bleakest moment, a quart of soup, the birds singing, medicine from the drugstore. What is it that keeps you going? Love, determination, guilt, hope, inertia, beauty, prayer. Whatever it is, embrace it. Practice it like scales on the piano. Use it every day. Let it have a place on the shelf where it comes most readily to hand. Be prepared to let go of what you thought was true about your place in the world and your assignment and the Dow Jones average of your ego. All that is about to change, or has changed already. But somewhere is a through line. That thing you once said mattered most of all. Truth, was it? Or kindness? Self-awareness? Justice and mercy, and oh yeah, humility? Your covenant with all that is holy? Reverence for life? Sort through the accumulations of mind and heart and spirit. Now is the time. Find that battered compass, that awkward plumb bob, the thing that points true north when all else reels, that says, this is a straight line up and down, when everything around you leans crazily. This is what we are here for, you know? To comfort you, not with soothing, but with the memory of a straight line and a true direction. In the valley of the shadow of death, look not for pillows. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me, the psalmist said, pointing my journey forward. What we have always taken for granted is not necessarily true. Here, we assert the difference between the earned truth, the committed ideal, and what is merely accepted because it is unchallenged. Come then, light once again the chalice flame in your home, in your heart. Draw up strength and courage for the days to come from this heritage and this hope. Our dignity and worth are not conditional, and we are bound together in a single web whose fate includes us all. Whatever else dissolves under the pressure of these times, may these convictions stand firm and guide us to rebuild a better world than before. If you have a chalice or candle with you, I invite you to join me and light that flame where you are. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you may see the comment button. If you click it, you should be able to type. If that works for you, I invite you to send a comment telling us all where you are participating. Say the chalice is lighted in Raytown, or the chalice is lighted in Westport, or the chalice is lighted at 60th and Knoll, or the chalice is lighted at Kingswood. We will pause for a moment to watch where else the chalice is lit. And while we are looking at the comment screen, if you have a joy or a concern for us to share at the end of the service, you can add that to the comments as well. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry.
I light this chalice
to celebrate Unitarian Universalism.
This is the Church of the Open Mind.
This is the torch of the loving heart.
Help.
This is the church of the helping hand.
Together we care for our earth.
And work for peace and friendship in our world.
Would you join me now in speaking again the words of the promise that unites us, our community's covenant? Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. It is such a delight to welcome to our virtual pulpit this morning Dr. Ali Kateusz, a renowned student of women's roles in the early development of Christianity. Dr. Kateusz is a recipient of the Elisabeth Schüssler Fiorenza New Scholar Award and now works as a research associate with the Wijngaards Institute of Catholic Research in London. She is also the daughter of our member and friend Jane Gilbreath, and I was excited to learn that she would be visiting Kansas City and would be able to share with us some of her recent work. As the Christian church became increasingly institutional and invested in the support of patriarchy and empire, its debt to the women founders was made largely invisible and over time forgotten. As the Christian tradition debates the role of women leaders in the global church of today, it is crucial that these stories be rediscovered and told. Ancient art testifies to the prominence and authority of women in the early church, and Dr. Kateusz is one of the leading experts in the interpretation of these artifacts. I am fascinated to hear what she has recently learned and will share with us this morning.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. Some of you may not realize that I actually went to Sunday school in this very church. My mother, Jane Gilbreath, used to bring me and my brothers and sister. And we attended Sunday school and we learned a lot about a lot of different religions. We learned about Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and ancient Greek and Roman religions. But there was one religion that we just never really got very close to. It was almost verboten, and that's Christianity. So one thing I didn't take away from this church is any notion or preconceptions really about what Christianity was. What did stick with me from this church, however, is the profound sense of social justice that permeates this church, the sense of equality and fairness, and the activism that goes along with that. And that, I believe, has really been a foundation for my research into early Christianity. Although I came to the early Christian era without a foundation in Christianity per se, kind of as an outsider rather than as an insider. And when I look at the data, I see it differently than people who are scholars who come from a Christian background see it. It's a sense of social justice that really keeps me interested in this field. And as I show you some of the work that I've been researching, some of it published several times recently, and another piece that I'm just starting to work on that's relevant to this time period just after Easter, I think you'll see what I'm talking about and why it matters.
Now I invite you to join our choir section leaders in our opening hymn. The words will appear on your screen. This will be followed by a video meditation lifting up the many people we hold in our hearts during these difficult days in both concern and gratitude.
Soon the day will arrive when we will be together, and no longer will we live in fear. And the children will smile without wondering whether on that day thunder clouds will appear. Wait to see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait to see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Some have dreams, some have died to make a bright tomorrow, and our vision remains in our hearts. Now the torch must be passed with new hope, not in sorrow, and a promise to make a new start. Wait to see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait to see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me.
Praise be the nurses and doctors, every medical staff bent over flesh to offer care, for lives saved and lives lost, for showing up either way. Praise for the farmers tilling soil, planting seeds so food can grow, an act of hope if ever there was. Praise be the janitors and garbage collectors, the grocery store clerks and the truck drivers barreling through long, quiet nights. Give thanks for bus drivers, delivery persons, postal workers, and all those keeping an eye on water, gas, and electricity. Blessings on our leaders making hard choices for the common good, offering words of assurance. Celebrate the scientists working away to understand the thing that plagues us, to find an antidote, and all the medicine makers. Praise be the journalists keeping us informed. Praise be the teachers, finding new ways to educate children from afar, and blessings on parents holding it together for them. Blessed are the elderly and those with weakened immune systems, all those who worry for their health. Praise for those who stay at home to protect them. Blessed are the domestic violence victims on lockdown with abusers, the homeless and refugees. Praise for the artists and poets, the singers and storytellers, all those who nourish with words and sound and color. Blessed are the ministers and therapists of every kind, bringing words of comfort. Blessed are the ones whose jobs are lost, who have no savings, who feel fear of the unknown gnawing. Blessed are those in grief, especially who mourn alone. Blessed are those who have passed into the great night. Praise for police and firefighters, paramedics, and all who work to keep us safe. Praise for all the workers and caregivers of every kind. Praise for the sound of notifications, messages from friends reaching across the distance. Give thanks for laughter and kindness. Praise be our four-footed companions with no forethought or anxiety, responding only in love. Praise for the seas and rivers, forests and stones who teach us to endure. Give thanks for your ancestors, for the wars and plagues they endured and survived. Their resilience is in your bones, your blood. Blessed is the water that flows over our hands and the soap that helps keep them clean each time a baptism. Praise every moment of stillness and silence so new voices can be heard. Praise the chants and slowness. Praise be the birds who continue to sing the sky awake each day. Praise for the primrose poking yellow petals from dark earth. Blessed is the air clearing overhead so one day we can breathe deeply again. And when this has passed, may we say that love spread more quickly than any virus ever could. May we say this was not just an ending, but also a place to begin.
Many different paths of spiritual wisdom suggest that the practices of gratitude and compassion are the best ways to nurture ourselves in particularly difficult times. May we all continue to hold in our hearts both those who serve and those who suffer during these days of isolation, worry, and sorrow. The gospel narratives that have come down to us in the New Testament as we have it today are filled with tantalizing references to the community of women who believed in, traveled with, and supported the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, including his mother Mary. In the years immediately following his death, the community that had grown up around Jesus had to decide how to survive in his absence and how to define itself. Much has been written about the men who were leaders in that early generation, but the stories of the women have fallen into deliberate obscurity. In her first major book, published in July of 2019, Dr. Ali Kateusz explores the significance of artifacts which suggests that women were deacons, priests, and even bishops in the early church. Mary and early Christian women, hidden leadership, suggests that there is much more than we are aware of today that might be known about women's power in our cultural history. I would like to hear more.
I'm going to talk about the two very oldest iconographic artifacts that depict real people inside a real church. These are the two very oldest, and both of them date to around the year 430, and both were buried underground in the early Christian era and not dug up until the 20th century. Both depict famous churches, interior, the Holy of Holies of two famous churches. The first, and the most interesting, because it's been the subject of some censorship by the Roman Catholic Church, depicts the altar area of Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The second one depicts the altar area of the second Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And that was the big basilica that burned down and was replaced by the huge Hagia Sophia that Justinian built around 550. So what's really interesting about these two artifacts is that both of them depict men and women in parallel around the altar table, in the altar area. Let me repeat that. The sculptors depicted men and women in parallel in the Holy of Holies. Keep in mind, for context, that the oldest depiction of a man by himself, or men by themselves, at the altar of a church, the oldest surviving depictions of men at the altar of a real church are 8th century. So we don't have, even though we might imagine, and for a long time I assumed there must be many artifacts that depict men and men only. When we actually go and look, they aren't there. Our imagination of the early Christian past becomes shattered when we actually look at the oldest artifacts and when we realize what's not there, which is the men only at the altar table. So I've written on what I'm going to show you right now in a number of articles and books. First, it was first published in 2017 in a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. In 2019, my book, Mary and Early Christian Women, came out, and I've dedicated a chapter or two to it. It's also in a chapter of a 2020 book that just came out this spring, which I co-edited with Marianne Beavis, which is titled Miriam, Rediscovering the Marys. I have an article coming out this spring in an evangelical journal, the Priscilla Papers, and a chapter coming out later this year in an Oxford University Press anthology on early Christian era women leaders in Christianity and Judaism. So I read a paper last summer at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, which garnered a tremendous amount of press. And it was on this topic about women at the altar table in the early Christian era. And it was reported in venues as divergent as the Daily Beast, to the Daily Mail, to the National Catholic Reporter, and a number of other Catholic journals, both in English and several other languages around the world. So it's a topic of quite a bit of interest. It's had a fair bit of exposure. So I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch of what you would find in some of my articles. And I tend to find that art speaks for itself. But I also like art a lot because art tells its own story. Whereas a lot of times we think we know what's in manuscripts, but manuscripts are often later. And even though they purport to be of an early text, they may have undergone a number of scribal changes as copyists did their thing or did what their masters wished them to do until the date which we actually have a manuscript of something from the early era. So art, especially this art that's been hidden, well, not hidden necessarily, but buried and then rediscovered recently, tells a really different story than what has survived in manuscripts. So this is the first of the two artifacts. It's an ivory box, an ivory reliquary box that was discovered in the ruins of a Roman era church, buried beneath probably what would have been the high altar. And it depicts a liturgical scene. And when it was first discovered around the year 1906, it was immediately identified, and there's not been any controversy whatsoever, that there are men on the left here and men here at the altar table, a woman at the altar table, and two women here. So the gender, the sex of the people who are in this scene has never really been in controversy whatsoever, and still is not. And for the first 4 decades, when scholars were looking at this book, at this box, and people were terribly interested in it because, it was the very oldest surviving depiction of the liturgy in a church. And there was a great deal of interest in it and wide number of articles on it. But there was really never any controversy in the first 4 decades that it was a man and a woman at an altar table here in the center. You have the ciborium or a canopy over the altar, and you've got the curtains, you've got a cross back here. There was really no controversy whatsoever that this was a church, people in a church, some kind of service. Now, the question was, what were the man and the woman doing at the altar? Because as Anton Geniers, who was the first to write about it, said, oh, where's the priest? Where's the third person? Where's the priest? It was very, nobody had a really good answer to that, but they all knew it was a very important box. And for several decades, they went on and continued to talk about it in this fashion. Now, probably within the first decade after it was discovered, people began to notice these spiral columns. There's 6 of them. And Constantine was reputed to have given 6 spiral columns to Old St. Peter's, as it's called Constantine's donation. And those columns are still present in the modern St. Peter's, in the galleries of the modern St. Peter's. And people began, scholars began to say, well, this could be old St. Peter's. Well, in 1941, at the beginning of World War II, the box was moved to Italy. And almost immediately afterwards, the Vatican began excavations beneath the high altar of the modern St. Peter's Basilica. Now, maybe they hoped to prove that this couldn't have been old St. Peter's, because after all, there was a woman and a man at what everybody agreed was the altar table. And as they dug down beneath the high altar, they came upon a stack of medieval altars, and at the very bottom, a 2nd century shrine. This part right here in the very center, it's about an 8x8 wall. It was encased in marble. It had a marble tabletop here embedded in it, and it had an arch back here. In fact, it was so close to what was found down there, they thought they had found the 2nd century shrine of St. Peter, around which the entire basilica had been built. And so suddenly there was no controversy. This was a scene in Old St. Peter's Basilica. So you can just imagine, the pointy hats or whoever was thinking in the Vatican that, what are we going to do here? Because we've just proven that this is a scene of Old St. Peter's in the very Holy of Holies. And they took 10 years to write a report on their excavations. And when they finally published their report, they had come to a different conclusion. This was no longer the altar, they said. No, this was not the altar. There was a portable altar, something really unusual. A portable altar in Old St. Peter's had to have been, right? Because after all, how could you have a woman at an altar? So they changed the definition of where the altar was. And at first, even within the Vatican, there were scholars who wrote that this was ridiculous. But over time, this became it matched the imagination of the past that the Vatican and the Anglican Church and some other churches wished to believe, actually. The scholars helped support it or didn't stop questioning it. And it kind of became accepted that this wasn't really the altar. Even those scholars who don't study it, they look at it, and they go, oh, well, that's the altar. But then, of course, you might read that it wasn't the altar. This scene, here's the liturgy. You can see the man with the two men here with their arms raised, the two women here with their arms raised, the man and the woman at the altar table. And then this was the close-up of the 2nd century shrine, which then was encased with marble when it became part of the Constantinian Church, and the man on the left and the woman on the right. And some scholars have said, well, the woman looks like she's lifting maybe a container of some sort or a bowl. What could this be? So it's a very interesting scene. And then several decades after the Vatican began their propaganda campaign, as I would call it, another artifact, the second artifact that is amongst the two very oldest artifacts, was discovered in an underground tomb chamber near the Constantinian walls in Istanbul. That would be ancient Constantinople. And this was the front of a massive sarcophagus, and it depicted the interior scene of the second Hagia Sophia. It was identified as such because the column capitals were very much the same as were known to have been in the second Hagia Sophia. So we have, again, the ciborium, the curtains, the early Christian cross on the left, a man with his arms raised, on the right, a woman with her arms raised. And, they're virtually in parallel poses down to the pointing of their feet. Next to the woman is a boy who has a book in his hand, an open book, which sometimes could symbolize the gospel books. And there was an old letter called the Letter of Cosmos, which said that Princess Bulgaria, around the year 430, and her younger brother used to participate in the communion in the Holy of Holies in the second Hagia Sophia. So it's contextualizing these two pieces together, which begins to tell a broader story of what was going on in the early church. So this is the second Hagia Sophia, and as it turns out, there is what is considered most likely a scene of the liturgy in the Justinian's Hagia Sophia a century later, which depicts, and it's considered Justinian's Hagia Sophia because it depicts Justinian on the left here with his men, and Theodora, the empress, on the right. And this is in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, on either side of the altar. So it's in the Holy of Holies. This is two pieces of mosaics here, two mosaic panels. And this is how they look. We have the men on the left, and Justinian is holding the plate for the bread. And Theodora is holding the chalice for the wine. She has two eunuchs on her left and 7 women on her right. And some of the women are holding these Eucharistic cloths or have them at their waist. These cloths later become, when used by men, are considered to be part of the accoutrements of the priest during the Eucharist. Over here by Justinian, we have the Bishop Maximianus, a man holding a book, and a man, a deacon presumably, holding a censer. So this is the oldest representation of a man with a censer in an early Christian church. So keep that in mind because we'll look at that again later. So this is considered to be a liturgical procession, often considered a liturgical procession in the Hagia Sophia that Justinian built in Constantinople. And it's very interesting because here we have Justinian holding the plate for the bread and Theodora holding the chalice for the wine. So when we go back 100 years earlier over in Old St. Peter's Basilica, and we see the man on the left and the woman on the right holding a chalice, perhaps. If she were a man, if she had been depicted as a man, almost certainly this would be considered a scene of 2 male bishops or 2 male priests performing the Eucharistic ceremony. It's quite a remarkable change to what we think we know about the early Christian era. And it has implications for women today because women in some of these churches need something like this to validate their own authority in those churches. When they can, the early Christian era is very political. When you can place women into the early Christian era at the church, in a positions of leadership and at the altar table itself, that matters. Let's just hold that thought and we'll come back shortly.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be with you virtually. Although I miss being with you in person. So in order to introduce today's offering, I want to remind everyone of the importance of our community, not just to ourselves, but to future members and to our staff and to our greater movement for social justice and a free religion. So these needs go on even though social distancing requires us not to be together. I ask you to be generous in your offering and to not forget there are options for giving in a planned way that you can put regular bank deposits or credit card charges. Go to the website if you have questions. And I sincerely hope everyone is staying safe and well. Our offering will now be given and gratefully received.
Let's say together the words of dedication for our offering. We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
The early Christian woman who probably is the number one woman to capture the imagination these days is Mary the Magdalene. And believe it or not, around Easter, in a lot of churches, especially the Catholic Church is notorious for this, the homily kind of skips over Mary Magdalene's role, believe it or not. They just eliminate those verses. So today it's kind of hard to find ancient evidence for Mary Magdalene other than the Gospels, although there is the Gospel of Mary and Acts of Philip and some other very provocative material that indicates that at least a woman named Mary remained well known as an early Christian leader and as a leader of the apostles. So in the Catholic Church in particular, and I think in evangelical churches as well, you get this kind of saying that, well, Jesus chose 12 men to be his apostles, so only men can be priests, only men can be at the altar table, only men can be the leaders. And it's conveniently overlooked that if you have this in the same metaphor, Jesus chose a woman, Mary Magdalene, and women to go and teach the men, to go and give the most important message in Christendom to the disbelieving, foolish, frightened men. So if these men are the priests, then by the same metaphor, these women would be their bishops. But that's been forgotten. So there is an artifact which depicts the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is over the site that was believed to be the cave where Jesus' body was buried and where Mary Magdalene and the women saw the risen Christ and he sent them on their mission. So it's very interesting to see what the liturgy is like in this, as depicted on this ivory pyx of this artifact. And before we do that, there's something I got to warn you that first I want to do a little head game. So I'm going to just do a slight head game here. So this is the ivory pyx. And we see the altar area with this table and a lamp and curtains around it and a ciborium over it, the canopy over the altar. And we see two people with censers coming towards it. And it's round like the rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the famous rotunda. And as we go around the side of the pyx, the sculptor carved a procession to the altar. Very beautifully carved. And as we look at this, and I have just started using this, when we see men in this position, it's easy for us to think, oh, well, we understand that these are priests and bishops and deacons. And this actually is the third oldest artifact to depict people at the altar table of a real church, and it is the very oldest to depict only one sex in that role. But what happens when we realize that these are women who have been depicted? So let's look at them again. These are women in this liturgical procession, not men, women, and only women. It's a liturgical procession of women in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a site of where Jesus met the women and sent them as apostles to the apostles. or as Pope Francis calls Mary Magdalene these days, the apostle to the apostles. So to me, I think what we have here is liturgical traditions of the Magdalene. And I'm just starting work on this project, but I think it has a lot of promise. And I think it's very appropriate to bring it here the Sunday after Easter. I enjoy this research. It's always a surprise to me. Every time I come to it, there's always something new that I can add to this story. The description of the material things that we find in the past. It's really a way of looking at the past that's very different than the way certain churches would like us to look at the past today. And it's a way of looking at the past that has potential to influence more than just those churches, because the religion that is pervasive and that it gives the image of women as subordinate and not quite everything a man is, all through the culture here. And it's the social justice that I learned in this church that makes me very interested, even as a non-Christian, although I certainly have more affinity with Christians today, to continue doing this research and to support it. And I just find it fascinating, the things that have been overlooked, the data, the patterns in the data that are ignored. It's something I like to share, and I'm glad to have been able to share it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Kateusz. We hope you continue to discover more about the hidden leadership of women in religious history and help us all to remember this important aspect of our heritage. Part of the exploration of contemporary women's spirituality has been the creative effort to find images for the divine that reflect female reality and experience. Our next hymn, Lady of the Season's Laughter, was a contribution to the attempt to balance the masculine images of God found in much traditional liturgy and hymnody with a new vocabulary of feminine imagery. I invite you to join in singing with the words that will appear on the screen.
When the winter
community's commitment to human fellowship has always called us to share in one another's celebrations and to weep together with those who mourn. This means that we have sometimes set aside a few moments in our gatherings to tell about the joys and concerns that are shaping our lives. As we learn new ways to continue sharing our journeys, to be connected across the distances of safety, we are trying this way to continue sharing our journeys. And so we have invited you to write your joys and concerns in the chat area, and I will read them aloud so that we may all send our caring thoughts. Our beginning joy is always to welcome those who may have joined us for the first time today, and we welcome friends and visitors from the UU congregation in Warrensburg, Missouri, from North Carolina, from South Minneapolis, and from St. Cloud, Minnesota. With sorrow, we honor the memory of Joe Williams, who died on Wednesday, April 15th, and hold his wife Floy and all of his family in our loving sympathy. Other joys and concerns include Barbara, who says that she is very happy that Ruth is home. Andrea, who says, "Thank you, Peggy Schrock, for all the masks you've made to help others." Richard, who says he has 5 promising job interviews during the past week. Kay, who has a concern for our friend Addie, who is hospitalized in Fort Collins, Colorado, where she now lives, having pneumonia. Richard also has a joy that he and I are setting up a Zoom meeting for those struggling with unemployment that will happen a week from Monday. Scott is concerned that his dad has been in the hospital with an infection, and he sounds good, but knowing that he has to be there alone without visitors is hard. Jan has a joy that yesterday was her and Ralph's 51st wedding anniversary. Congratulations to both of you. Those are the joys and concerns that have been shared today. And now I invite you to speak with me the words of our congregational response. These are from activist Dorothy Day, and they'll appear on your screen. People say, "What is the sense of our small effort?" They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread out in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's too much work to do. Let's join our voices together in our closing song. Wish these flames, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community no matter how far flung, or the fires of commitment. For these we carry in our minds and hearts until the time shall come when we are together again. Thank you for being with us online this morning. Please join us now for a social hour by following the directions on the screen, and come back next week when we will observe the 50th anniversary of the celebration of Earth Day.